In June of 1935, in the humid heat of northern Queensland, a small shipment of squat, warty amphibians arrived from Hawaii and was carried into a breeding pen on the edge of Australia's sugarcane country. There were just over 100 of them, and they had been hauled to the far side of the world to do a single job: to eat the beetles that were chewing through the colony's most valuable crop. Within weeks, they were breeding by the thousand, and within a couple of years, tens of thousands of their offspring had been turned loose into the cane fields around Cairns and Gordonvale. On paper, it was a tidy piece of problem solving. In reality, it was one of the worst ecological decisions ever made on the continent, and at least one person saw it coming. A prominent entomologist of the day warned in print that this great toad, immune from enemies and breeding all year round, could become as ruinous as the rabbit, and for a brief moment further releases were actually banned. Then the ban was overturned under political pressure, and the toads kept coming. Because the toads could not climb the cane to reach the beetles, so they ignored the pest entirely, and turned instead to everything else. And they carried with them a weapon that Australia had no answer for. These were cane toads, and tucked into the glands behind their eyes was a milky poison, strong enough to kill almost anything on the continent foolish. Enough to bite one. 90 years later, the descendants of that single 100-strong shipment number, by some estimates, in the hundreds of millions, and they have rolled across tropical Australia in a slow, poisonous tide that by some measures advances tens of kilometers every year, leaving dead quolls, dead goannas, dead snakes, and dead freshwater crocodiles in their wake, and pushing on toward the Kimberley, one of the last great wild strongholds in the country. Nothing native could stop them. Nothing native could even safely eat them. And then researchers began to notice that something was killing the toads after all. Quietly, at the muddy edges of the water, in their million. Not a crocodile, not a snake, not some clever poison or imported super predator. An ant, an ordinary native ant you could crush without noticing, doing what every large, dangerous animal on the continent could not. This is that story. This is the full story. From the catastrophic miscalculation that loosed a chemical weapon across a continent, to the strange biological accident that leaves the most toxic invader in Australia helpless in front of an insect smaller than a grain of rice, to the careful and very real limits of what that discovery can actually do. Most clips about this just show you a baby toad swarmed by ants. Call it satisfying or grim and scroll on. This one follows why it happened, why it works on the toad and almost never on the native frogs sitting right beside it, and why the scientists who found it are far more measured about it than the headlines ever are. Every claim in this video is grounded in the published research of the University of Sydney team that studied it, the group led by Professor Rick Shine and the ecologist Georgia Wardfear, whose work on these ants and toads appeared in journals including Functional Ecology and the Journal of Applied Ecology, alongside the long record kept by Australian wildlife agencies of what the cane toad has done since 1935. This is not a viral curiosity dressed up as a fact. This is what the peer-reviewed science actually document, and the real version, as usual, is stranger and more interesting than the clip. But before you can understand why an ant succeeds where a crocodile dies, you have to understand the toad. And you have to understand the single assumption that made it seem unstoppable in the first place, because that assumption is exactly the thing the ant turns inside out. The cane toad's superpower is chemistry. From the day it hatches to the day it dies, at every stage of its life, it is toxic. Behind the shoulders of an adult sit two large glands that produce a substance known as toxin, and when a predator clamps down, that poison floods its mouth. For an Australian animal, the result is usually fast and fatal. A northern quoll, a small spotted marsupial hunter found across the tropical north, bites a toad and dies. A goanna, one of the big monitor lizards that had ruled these floodplains for ages, swallows a toad and dies. Snakes die. Freshwater crocodiles die. In some regions, populations of these native predators crashed by more than 90% within months of the toad front arriving, because the animals had no evolutionary history with a poisonous toad and no instinct to leave it alone. And here is the assumption buried inside all of that death, the one almost everybody made, including, for decades, the scientists. The reason nothing could stop the cane toad was that its poison was simply too good. It looked like an invulnerable animal, but it was never invulnerable. It was invulnerable to one specific kind of enemy, and almost nobody was looking at the other kind, because that beautiful, terrible poison evolved over millions of years in the Americas to do one job: to punish animals with backbones, the mammals and reptiles and birds that hunt by mouth and can be brought down by a toxin that attacks the nerves and the heart. It is a weapon aimed squarely at vertebrate, and an ant is not a vertebrate. An ant is built on a completely different chassis, a tiny armored body running on a system the toxin was never designed to attack. The poison that drops a crocodile in minutes does very little to an insect that simply does not work the way the poison expects. The toad spent millions of years perfecting a defense against the wrong enemy for the place it would end up. And in tropical Australia, the wrong enemy is everywhere. The animal we are talking about is the meat ant, a common, aggressive, native Australian ant of the genus Iridomyrmex, the kind that builds those broad gravel-top nests you see all over the country and swarms anything edible in seconds. They were here long before the toad, and they will be here long after. And for most of the toad's reign, nobody thought of them as a threat to it at all. But then the University of Sydney team looked closely at the most vulnerable moment in a cane toad's entire life, and they found a trap so perfect it almost looks designed. When cane toads breed, they lay tens of thousands of eggs, and those eggs become tadpoles, and the tadpoles transform into tiny toadlets called metamorph, each one barely the size of a fingernail and weighing a fraction of a gram. And those metamorphs do something that in Australia is close to suicidal. Unlike most native frogs, which emerge under cover of darkness and vanish into vegetation, the baby cane toads come out by day, and they cluster on the open, sun-baked mud right at the edge of the water. They do it for their own reason. Partly because they are so small they dry out fast and have to stay near the water, and partly to avoid being eaten by the larger cane toads that hunt at night, because an adult cane toad will happily cannibalize the young. So they trade one danger for another, and the danger they walk straight into is the meat ant, which patrols exactly those hot, open, muddy margins in exactly those daylight hours hunting. The overlap is almost total. If you have ever wondered whether the natural world keeps its own quiet accounts, this is what it looks like. And if stories told this way are why you are here, take a second to subscribe, because this is the only kind we tell. Now here is the part that turns an unlucky overlap into an execution. When a meat ant finds one of these baby toads, the toad does the worst possible thing it could do. It freezes. Back in the Americas, where these toads evolved, sitting perfectly still and trusting your camouflage is a sensible way to avoid being spotted by a predator that hunts with its eyes. But an ant does not hunt with its eyes. It hunts by touch and by scent trail, and a motionless toadlet is not hidden from it. It is simply a stationary meal. The native frogs, which have shared this landscape with these ants for an immense span of time, do the opposite. They sense the ants and they flee fast on the long, strong legs of animals that grew up in this exact arena. The baby cane toad, by contrast, is slow, with short little limbs and clumsy hops. It fails to notice the ants closing in, and when they reach it, it sits still and relies on a defense that is completely useless against an insect. The researchers laid these traits out plainly. The toad picks the open ground, moves in the daylight, cannot escape well, and freezes when attacked. Every one of those traits was an advantage somewhere in its ancestral home. Every one of them is a death sentence at the edge of an Australian billabong. Scientists have a name for this. They call it an evolutionary trap, where a behavior that kept a species alive for millions of years becomes lethal the instant it is dropped into a world it never adapted to. And this is the finding that made the discovery matter. The ATL that lifts it above a curiosity. The ants devastate the cane toads while leaving the native frogs essentially alone. It is selective. The very same patrolling ant that is a massacre for a baby toad is something the local frogs routinely detect and outrun. The predator, completely by accident, draws a line between the invader and the natives and enforces it. That is the holy grail of this kind of control. A pressure that falls hardest on the species you want gone and barely touches the species you want to protect. And here it was, happening on its own, with no one importing anything, no new species loosed onto the continent, no risk of repeating the original mistake of 1935. So the researchers asked the obvious next question. If the ants are already doing this, could you help them do more of it? And in a field experiment, they did something almost comically simple. They put out bait, ordinary cat food, near the toad emergence sites to draw more meat ants into the area during the brief window when the toadlets were swarming out of the water. By concentrating the ants where and when the baby toads were most exposed, they pushed toad deaths up several times over by more than fourfold in their results, using nothing but a native insect that was already on site and a tin of pet food. Cheap, low technology, and native from start to finish. And that is the moment the The triumphant version of this story wants to roll the credits on the image of the unstoppable poison toad, finally meeting its match in a humble ant. But the scientists themselves are careful here, and so should we be, because there are limits the headline never mentioned. The ants strike the toads at one specific fleeting stage, the tiny metamorph at the water's edge. They do nothing to the giant adults, which can grow to the size of a dinner plate and weigh as much as 2 kilograms, and they cannot touch the tens of thousands of eggs and tadpoles still in the water. A single female toad can lay enough eggs in one clutch to refill a pond, so even a wildly successful ant is not an off switch for the cane toad. It is a pressure, a way to kill far more of the most vulnerable young in the places that matter most. One promising tool sitting alongside others, the trapping, the taste aversion training that teaches quolls to leave toads alone, the genetic work, none of which is a magic solution on its own. This is not the day the cane toad was defeated. It is the day we understood it could be pushed. And the deeper truth underneath it is the part worth carrying out of this story. The cane toad was never the unstoppable monster it appeared to be. It only looked unstoppable because for decades the entire continent kept measuring it against animals with backbones, the crocodiles and snakes and marsupial, that its poison was specifically built to kill. We kept testing it against precisely the enemies it was designed to beat. The answer, when it finally came, was not a bigger predator or a cleverer poison or another import from overseas, which is the very thing that started this whole catastrophe in the first place. The answer had been underfoot the entire time, an ordinary native ant, untroubled by the one trick the toad had, waiting at the edge of the water in the daylight, and all anyone had to do was look down. So here is the whole strange thing in a single breath. 102 toads carried from Hawaii in 1935 to kill some beetles that instead bred into a poisonous tide of hundreds of millions and rolled across a continent, killing everything that tried to eat them. A chemical weapon so effective against animals with backbones that it looked like nothing could ever stop it. And then, at the muddy, sunlit edge of the water, the toad's own babies walking straight into a native ant they never evolved to fear, freezing when they should run, dying by the million in front of an insect their poison was never built to harm. Not beaten, but for the first time, beatable, and beatable by the smallest, cheapest, and most overlooked hunter in the entire story, one that had been standing in the toad's path since long before the first cage was ever opened. But the cane toad is not the only invader whose greatest strength turned out to hide a fatal weakness. In our next video, we travel to an island overrun by a predator that arrived by ship, an animal so successful it had quietly erased nearly everything that nested on the ground, until conservationists found the one flaw in its biology that let them clear an entire island and bring the vanished birds roaring back. If you thought a tiny ant toppling Australia's most toxic invader was a strange way to win, wait until you see what they exploited on that island. Subscribe so you do not miss it, because you will never look at an invasive species the same way again.